Hi everyone, I hope you're all okay and have enjoyed Stormbreaker so far. We'll be reading the rest of chapter 1 today together. Thank you to everyone who's emailed in and told us what work you've been up to. It's really lovely to hear from so many of you. Keep up the good work. So for today's reading lesson, we're going to be looking at the same learning objective as last lesson, which was to retrieve and record information. Starting off then, last lesson we read the first half of chapter 1 and we finished it with Alex starting to get a little bit suspicious. And I asked you this question: why did Alex think it was strange that his uncle was not wearing a seatbelt when he had a car accident? So you've had plenty of time to think. I wonder what you came up with. I think that Alex said that Ian was always very careful and always wore his seatbelt. Therefore, he thought it was suspicious when the police told him he wasn't wearing one when the car accident happened. And that was why Alex was starting to ask some questions. So we're going to read the rest of chapter 1 today. Before we do that, I'm going to talk through a few tricky vocabulary words that you may not know what they mean, so that when we read it, it will hopefully make a little bit more sense. So, first of all, solicitor is our first tricky word today, which is a noun meaning a person, someone who is a lawyer, so someone who deals with legal matters. Second, we're looking at the word will, which is a noun, which is a document instructing how a person's property should be divided after they die, their belongings and money. Vaguely is an adverb that we'll come across today, which means slightly or roughly. Chairman is a noun that we'll read in this part of the story, which is a president or head of a committee or company. And lastly, a holster, which is another noun, which is a holder for a gun that is worn on a belt or under the arm. So you can practice saying those words, shouting, whispering, clapping or acting like we do in class if you would like to. Let's have a practice at reading some tricky words. We've got 2 year 5 and 6 words to start off with. We've got the word foreign, which is an adjective meaning from another country or language, and cemetery, which is a noun, a place where people are buried. So you can practice reading those words, make sure you know what they mean. Then we have got another word we'll come across today in the story, which is familiar, which is an adjective. And you may spot that the root word is family, and familiar links to that. It means well known or close or often experienced. And lastly, we've got a word in the story that links to a spelling rule we've looked at this year, a year 5-6 spelling rule. Can you work out what it is? Well done if you spotted. It links to the rule when we add a suffix, in this case an ed past tense suffix, to make it into a past tense verb. When we add the suffix ed, we double the consonant in the middle, we double the R. So prefer becomes preferred because we still hear the stressed fur sound in the middle. Prefer, preferred, so we double the R. That's a spelling rule we have talked about this year. And prefer means to like one thing better than the other. So I'm going to read the next part of the story, and then I'm going to show you how to answer some true or false retrieval questions. The day dragged on. Alex hadn't gone to school, even though secretly he had wanted to. He would have preferred to escape back into normal life. The clang of the bell, the crowds of familiar faces, instead of sitting there, trapped inside the house. But he had to be there for the visitors who came throughout the morning and the rest of the afternoon. So my first true or false question is, Alex is bored. So when we are retrieving, we can skim and scan the text that we're looking at to look for the answers to our question, looking for the evidence. So Alex is bored. Now, I haven't got a specific sentence that tells me whether he's bored or not, but I can look at some of the words that have been used. And I can see this first sentence here gives me a bit of information. The day dragged on. And I can see that here it says that Alex was trapped inside the house. So the use of those two words, the day dragged and that he felt trapped inside the house helps me to answer the retrieval question, and the answer is true. Alex is bored. So explaining my answer using some evidence from the text can help me answer a retrieval question. Next one, true or false? Alex didn't want to go to school. Again, skim and scan for the part in the text that you want to be looking at. I can see I've got a keyword here, school, that might help me locate it quickly. Alex hadn't gone to school, even though secretly he had wanted to. So this is a more obvious retrieval question because the answer is right there in the text and it tells me false. He had wanted to go to school, and it tells me here that he wanted to go back to normal. Next question. Alex was alone all day. So again, skim and scan your text, looking for the part where it talks about what you're looking at. And right here in this last sentence it says, but he had to be there for the visitors who came throughout the morning and the rest of the afternoon. So I can see quite clearly that that one is also false. And then I can explain my answer a little bit more. False, he had lots of visitors, to show that I know whether it was true or false. Before I start reading the rest of the chapter, remember that if a word has a capital letter and it's in the middle of a sentence, it's a proper noun and it's likely to be the name of a person or a place. For example, Alex Rider or London both have capital letters. If they're used in the middle of a sentence, we can clearly see that they're proper nouns. So throughout this, the rest of this chapter, you might see some proper nouns that you haven't heard of, but we can still read those and just think, oh, that's probably a person or a place or the name of something, and that can help us to carry on reading and not worry too much about these unfamiliar words. There were 5 of them. A solicitor who knew nothing about a will, but seemed to have been charged with organising the funeral. So we've talked about the word solicitor, meaning a lawyer, and we've talked about a will, meaning the document or instructions for dividing a person's belonging after death. So it's obviously talking about Ian Ryder, his will and his funeral, because he's Alex Ryder's uncle who's just died. So the 5 of them, the 5 visitors to Alex's house that day. A funeral director who had been recommended by the solicitor, a vicar, tall, elderly, who seemed disappointed that Alex didn't look more upset. A vicar is somebody who works in a church. A neighbour from across the road. How did she even know that anyone had died? And finally, a man from the bank. All of us at the Royal and General are deeply shocked, he said. He was in his 30s, wearing a polyester suit with a Marks and Spencer's tie. He had the sort of face you forgot, even while you were looking at it, and had introduced himself as Crawley from personnel. But if there's anything we can do. So, Royal and General has got capital letters. We can assume that that's going to be the name of the bank that he works at. Crawley was how he introduced himself, so we can assume that that is his name. What will happen? Alex asked for the second time that day. You don't have to worry, Crawley said. The bank will take care of everything. That's my job. You leave everything to me. The day passed. Alex killed a couple of hours in the evening playing his Nintendo 64 and then felt vaguely guilty when Jack caught him at it. Vaguely meaning slightly guilty. But what else was he to do? Later on, she took him to a Burger King. He was glad to get out of the house, but the two of them barely spoke. Alex assumed Jack would have to go back to America. She certainly couldn't stay in London forever. So who would look after him? By law, he was still too young to look after himself. His whole future looked so uncertain that he preferred not to talk about it. He preferred not to talk at all. And then the day of the funeral arrived, and Alex found himself dressed in a dark jacket, preparing to leave in a black car that had come from nowhere, surrounded by people he had never met. Ian Ryder was buried in the Brompton Cemetery on the Fulham Road, just in the shadow of Chelsea football ground, and Alex knew where he would have preferred to be on that Wednesday afternoon. About 30 people had turned up, but he hardly recognised any of them. A grave had been dug close to the lane that ran the length of the cemetery, and as the service began, a black Rolls Royce drew up, the back door opened, and a man got out. Alex watched him as he walked forward and stopped. Overhead, a plane coming in to land at Heathrow momentarily blotted out the sun. Alex shivered. There was something about the new arrival that made his skin crawl. And yet the man was ordinary to look at. Grey suit, grey hair, grey lips, and grey eyes. His face was expressionless, the eyes behind the square. I'm going to stop there and I'm going to ask you a few true or false questions and see if you can retrieve the answers from the text. A. Alex travelled to the funeral in a Rolls Royce. B. The funeral was in the Chelsea football ground. C. About 30 people were at the funeral. So grab something to write with and see if you can write down, is each of those questions true or false, and just write a little explanation about how you know that. Pause the video and have a go. Welcome back. Okay, let's see if you were right. So A was false. Alex did not travel to the funeral in a Rolls Royce. Somebody else travelled to the funeral in a Rolls Royce. We can see that was a bit of a trick question there. The man got out of the Rolls Royce. We can see that Alex left in a black car, but we don't know what type of car it was. B was also false. Another trick question because it says the funeral was in the Chelsea football ground. If I skim and scan for Chelsea, which is easy because it's got a capital letter, I can see it's here. It mentions Chelsea football ground, but it says it was in the cemetery, just in the shadow of Chelsea football ground, which tells me it was nearby, it was next to it, but not actually in it. So another trick question there. And then C was true. I can see that if I look for 30 as a word rather than a number and skim and scan, I can find it quite quickly here. It says about 30 people had turned up. Okay, so that one was true. Well done if you got all of those right. Okay, my sentence carries on. So, his face was expressionless, the eyes behind the square, gunmetal spectacles completely empty. Perhaps that was what disturbed Alex. Whoever this man was, he seemed to have less life than anyone in the cemetery, above or below ground. Someone tapped Alex on the shoulder, and he turned round to see Mr. Crawley leaning over him. "That's Mr. Blunt," the personnel manager whispered. "He's the chairman of the bank." If you remember, a chairman was the president or the person in charge of a company. Alex's eyes travelled past Blunt and over to the Rolls Royce. 2 more men had come with him, one of them the driver. They were wearing identical suits, and although it wasn't a particularly bright day, sunglasses. Both of them were watching the funeral with the same grim faces. Alex looked from them to Blunt and then to the other people who had come to the cemetery. Had they really known Ian Ryder? Why had he never met any of them before? And why did he find it so difficult to believe that any of them really worked for a bank? He's still being quite suspicious, Alex, here, isn't he? A good man, a patriotic man, he will be missed. The vicar had finished his graveside address. His choice of words struck Alex as odd. Patriotic? That meant he loved his country. But as far as Alex knew, Ian Ryder had barely spent any time in it. Okay, let's stop there. I've got a few more true or false questions for you to see if you can retrieve these answers. A. Mr. Blunt is the chairman of the bank. B. The vicar described Ian as patriotic. C. It was a very sunny day. So, you can have a go, grab something to write with and write down your answers. And remember, look out for those tricky questions. Make sure you're skimming and scanning, looking in the text for the answer, and then explaining briefly how you know that. Pause the video and have a go. Okay, let's see how you go on. So, A was true. We can skim and scan for chairman, which I've easily highlighted for you here. And we can see that if we go back, we can read around maybe the little bit before, and just check that Mr. Crawley is saying, that's Mr. Blunt, he's the chairman of the bank. Not a trick question, that one. B, the vicar described Ian as patriotic. Now I can remember from reading it with 3 that patriotic was mentioned down at the end. I can skim and scan for it. It's mentioned a couple of times here and here, patriotic. And let me just check who was describing who as patriotic, which meant, and explains it here, he loved his country. So the vicar was talking. The vicar was doing the graveside address. That's like a speech to an audience, an address. He was the one talking, and he was describing somebody as patriotic. Let's read back. Who was he describing? He was describing the person that they're burying in the cemetery. He's describing Ian. So that one is also true. C, it was a very sunny day. So let's have a look, skim and scan for something to do with the weather or the sunshine. And see, here it mentions sunglasses. Read the sentence. They were wearing identical suits, and although it wasn't a particularly bright day, sunglasses. Okay, so the 2 men were wearing sunglasses, but it wasn't a particularly bright day. So false. It was not a very sunny day. Well done if you got those ones right. Let's carry on with the story. Certainly, he had never been one for waving the Union Jack, which is the British flag. He looked round, hoping to find Jack, but saw instead that Blunt was making his way towards him, stepping carefully around the grave. You must be Alex. The chairman was only a little taller than him. Close to, his skin was strangely unreal. It could have been made of plastic. My name is Alan Blunt, he said. Your uncle often spoke about you. That's funny, Alex said. He never mentioned you. The grey lips twitched briefly. We'll miss him. He was a good man. What was he good at? Alex asked. He never talked about his work. Suddenly, Crawley was there. Your uncle was overseas finance manager, Alex, he said. He was responsible for our foreign branches. You must have known that. I know he travelled a lot, Alex said, and I know he was very careful about things like seatbelts. Well, sadly, he wasn't careful enough. Blunt's eyes, magnified by the thick lenses of his spectacles, lasered into his own, and for a moment Alex felt himself pinned down like an insect under a microscope. I hope we'll meet again. Okay, for your task today, I'm going to give you a think question. You can choose whether you do one of the chili questions or all of them. So, my first chili 1 think question is, do you think Mr. Blunt is a good or evil character, and why? So, have a look through the text on that page to see if you can retrieve any evidence that might help you answer that question, and you can have a go at writing a quick answer down. Welcome back. So if you had a go at that question, you might have put something like this. I think Mr. Blunt is an evil character because in the text he's described as having grey lips, and I know that evil characters in stories are often described in not a very nice way. So he's got grey lips, it says here. And he stares at Alex uncomfortably. He makes him feel very scrutinised when he stares at him here. So I think he's going to be an evil character. I wonder if you agreed. Let's move on. Blunt went on. He tapped the side of his face with a single grey finger. Yes. Then he turned and went back to his car. It was as he was getting into the Rolls-Royce that it happened. The driver leaned across to open the back door and his jacket fell open, revealing the shirt underneath. And not just the shirt. The man was wearing a leather holster with an automatic pistol strapped inside. We learnt earlier that a holster was the holder for a gun. Alex saw it, even as the man, realising what had happened, quickly straightened up and pulled the jacket across his chest. Blunt had seen it too. He turned back and looked again at Alex. Something very close to an emotion slithered over his face. Then he got into the car. The door closed and he was gone. I like the use of the word slithered there. It makes it sound quite snake-like. An emotion slithered over his face. A gun at a funeral? Why? Why would bank managers carry guns? Let's get out of here. Suddenly, Jack was at his side. Cemeteries give me the creeps. Yes, and quite a few creeps have turned up, Alex muttered. They slipped away quietly and went home. The car that had taken them to the funeral was still waiting, but they preferred the open air. The walk took them 15 minutes. As they turned the corner into their street, Alex noted a removals van parked in front of the house. I'm going to stop there and give you a chilly 3-think question if you want to have a go at this one. So, explain the 2 ways the author uses the word creeps. So, skim and scan in the text, look for the word that is used twice and see if you can explain the 2 different ways the author has used the word. Pause the video, have a go if you want to. Okay, welcome back. So, as you can see, it's mentioned twice here in 2 different ways. So Jack uses the word creeps in this expression, gives me the creeps. This suggests that cemeteries make her feel nervous or frightened. Then Alex uses the word creeps here as a noun that shows he thinks the men who were at the cemetery are nasty people or even villains. So both uses of the word in slightly different ways hint at unease or possible danger for Alex and Jack. I wonder if you put something similar in your answer. Okay, let's move on. So Alex has just noticed a removals van parked in front of the house. The words striker and son painted on its side. What's that doing? He began. At the same moment, the van shot off, its wheels skidding over the surface of the road. Alex said nothing as Jack unlocked the door and let them in, but while she went into the kitchen to make some tea, he looked quickly around the house. A letter that had been on the hall table now lay on the carpet. A door that had been half open was now closed. Tiny details, but Alex's eyes missed nothing. Somebody had been in the house. He was almost sure of it. But he wasn't certain until he got to the top floor. The door to the office, which had always been locked, was unlocked now. Alex opened it and went in. The room was empty. Ian Ryder had gone, and so had everything else. The desk drawers, the cupboards, the shelves, anything that might have told him about the dead man's work had been taken. Alex! Jack was calling to him from downstairs. Alex took one look around the forbidden room, wondering again about the man who had once worked there. Then he closed the door and went back down. Okay, so that's the end of the chapter. And a chilly 2-think question then. Have a go at this one if you want to. How was Alex certain that somebody had been in the house? Pause the video, have a go. Welcome back. So there are a few pieces of evidence you could have found and included in your answer. Number 1, Alex noticed that a letter had fallen from the table to the carpet. Number 2, a door was left open when they went out, was now closed. But number 3, and when he became certain, was that the office door was unlocked, as usually it was always locked before. So quite a few clues that made Alex certain somebody had been in the house. Well done if you managed to get all of those. Okay, I hope you're enjoying the story so far. It does get very exciting. Alex is left feeling quite suspicious at the end of this chapter. If you have still got your work from last lesson, you could add some more details that we know from this second half of the chapter about Alex. You can rewind the video and read the story yourself from the screen and pick out some more details to add to it about Alex. Don't worry if you haven't got that anymore. We can discuss that a bit more next lesson. Okay, look forward to speaking to you again soon and hope you're enjoying the story. Bye for now.